You know, I talked about this a couple of years ago on camera, but the thing is, I just felt like doing an update on it, thinking about it and everything, and I do apologize if I sound a little blah. I am tired. I did work today. But, what's interesting about growing up in the 80s, especially the mid-80s, is you couldn't basically turn your head, one way or another without hearing about an animated movie coming out based on a franchise, whether it was to help start that franchise help start up the franchise, I should say, and send it in a direction that, the company behind it felt like it needed to go in. Or basically it was a movie based on a franchise that only had a couple of specials at first, but really needed, a movie to help it out, to really take it to that next level. And sometimes it was a franchise just based on, let's say, something that had the aspirations to be a franchise, got a cartoon and everything, but it was all thanks to a movie. I know that kind of sounded similar to what I just said, but still, it's one of those situations. And sometimes a movie was made, for theatrical release, but was meant to also be a miniseries because it was introducing a new character, and that miniseries introducing that new character was part of that character's show. What I'm getting at basically is growing up in the 80s, I saw a lot of movies, be released theatrically and direct to video based on some of the things I used to watch as a kid, some of the things that are now on DVD and streaming. Or YouTube and the like. For example, I was too young for this though, but I did see it as a kid. I do have it on DVD. But in 1980, Filmation took a lot of their episodes of their interpretation of Mighty Mouse, put them into a compilation of one movie, and released it theatrically. And what these episodes were was serials. S-E-R-I-L-E-S-L. You get the idea, serials. They were serials based, on a story, based on 11-minute shorts, if you will. Of the Filmation version of Mighty Mouse. And by piecing them together as a movie, they were able to release it in theaters called The Great Space Chase, I believe, or something like that. And that was the first that I knew of. For the decade of the 80s, that is. Like I said, I didn't really know about it until I saw it on television, or read it on VHS. But that was the first time in the 80s that a series had a movie made for theaters, but it consisted of several, episodes, but not several, but, a plethora of 11-minute shorts, that were one story combined. That was the first time it ever happened. But then you fast forward years later, and you have the mid-80s, the early to mid-80s, really be like the center point, be the centerpiece, if you will, of if it's an animated show based on a franchise, or it's a franchise that has had various specials and is on the verge of an animated show, then there's no doubt it's going to get a movie. And between 1985, 86, and 87, and even 88, that happened. That happened. It did. In 1985, as far as I know, we had He-Man and She-Ra, Secret of the Sword. Now, when the She-Ra series came out later, basically about a month or so later after the release of the movie, that movie that was just a month or so before in theaters was put out on television in 5 parts. Basically, it was the 5-part miniseries pilot, the 5-part miniseries pilot for She-Ra. That's what it was. And again, as I mentioned about Mighty Mouse, this was done in a similar fashion by the same people, Filmation, but in reverse. but in reverse. And what I mean by in reverse, I'm talking about the fact that the episodes, the miniseries, was basically the movie broken up into 5 parts. That's what it was. So it was the reverse effect. It was the reverse effect. But in 1986, the following year, that comes around, and you get hit with a peripheral of animated features. Hasbro basically took on 2 of those spots in 1986. They did. Well, 2 of the other spots were taken over by Paramount Pictures and Clubhouse Pictures. Paramount Pictures and Clubhouse Pictures. Clubhouse Pictures was mainly a mostly kid/family entertainment label that would release movies in theaters for a limited time, as well as directly to video. They were kind of like another one I'm going to mention in a moment. But what's interesting about this is those 2 slots that Hasbro took over. Those 2 slots that Hasbro took over were from My Little Pony the movie, and this was after the 2 primetime specials, Rescue from Midnight Castle, or Escape from Midnight Castle, and Escape from Catarina, and before the animated film, or before the animated series, which by the way served, the first 5 episodes served as a sequel, pseudo-sequel to the movie, if not a continuation. But yeah, basically My Little Pony the movie came out in 1986, a month or 2 before Transformers the movie. Transformers the movie, which took place in between season 2 and 3, and what's interesting is just like with My Little Pony the movie, the season 3 premiere was a 5-part miniseries pseudo-sequel continuation called 5 Faces of Darkness. The one for My Little Pony, which was a pseudo-sequel continuation of the movie, was called The End of Flutter Valley. So basically, Hasbro and Sunbow wanted to continue, the writing teams wanted to continue the stories from the movies, but a little bit, fast forward in time by maybe a year or a couple of months. So that was kind of interesting. It was really interesting. And what was also interesting, as far as I know, with both, is that both had footage from the movie either in flashback or basically as a recap way to catch people up to speed. But what's also interesting about it too is just like with She-Ra, they too ended up having their movie split into 5 parts. Yeah. My Little Pony the movie and Transformers the movie eventually, about a couple of years later, had their movies, the theatrical films, split into 5-part miniseries. No joke. No joke on that. But again, they weren't the only ones that had 86, wrapped around their finger for theatrical release. Gobots also had a theatrical release called Battle of the Rock Lords, which was kind of a crossover with the other, I guess you could say, I think it was Kenner that released them. Correct me if I'm wrong. Kenner or something like that released them. And basically, they also released another toy line called the Rock Lords. So they decided, let's cross over both entities, and thus you had Gobots Battle of the Rock Lords, which was essentially Gobots the movie. And that came out a few months prior, to Transformers and My Little Pony. But it wasn't the only one. In 1986, we had a compilation film called Heathcliff the movie. And the only original animation we had in there was Heathcliff narrating to his 3 nephews about his various adventures in town, if not abroad. And that was about it, because all you had was a variety of Heathcliff shorts that Heathcliff was narrating through a family album, that was showcased. Now, was it given a theatrical release? Yes, it was. And it was by Columbia. It was not Columbia, but it was done by Clubhouse Pictures. Clubhouse Pictures, Gobots was the one released by Paramount. And what's interesting is Heathcliff the movie being a compilation film. Well, I I don't think it had a miniseries, for the film. It didn't. And if it did, it's one of those rare times that I didn't see it, or if I did, I just can't remember it. But we're not done. 1987 comes around, and we get G.I. Joe the movie. Now, we all know about the history behind the scenes. And I've talked about G.I. Joe the movie, a lot so far. I've talked about them a lot so far. And G.I. Joe the movie was supposed to be theatrical, but because of the box office failure, bomb, if you will, of Transformers and My Little Pony, basically Hasbro made the decision to release it direct to television and video. And how do I know this? Well, being a kid in 1987, and I think I was about 8 years old, or at least going on 8 years old, I used to, go through that TV guide, just like a lot of us did, looking for any kind of animated movies or specials that would come on primetime, mostly towards the weekend, and see if maybe I can, convince my family to let me watch it. Well, 1987 came around. I was going through the TV guide, and lo and behold, I don't know when it was. I know probably was about maybe it was the late spring, early summer. I can't really remember. But I'm flipping through this. And next thing I know, I look, and it's in bold, and it's in grayish bold. Bold grayish, dark grayish, whatever. I look at this, and it says on KTVU, from 7 to 9 p.m., G.I. Joe the movie. And I'm like, wait a minute. As a kid, I'm thinking, oh my God, this is a G.I. Joe movie? Why wasn't it advertised? But I'm excited. I'm excited, but I'm also wondering, why wasn't it advertised? Anyway, that gets my attention, and then I find out later on it's also on VHS, courtesy of not Family Home Entertainment, FEG, who you would think would do it since they were the distributors of both, G.I. Joe, Transformers, My Little Pony, and Jam, on VHS. You would think it'd be FHE, but nope. Instead, it's another distributor called Kid Classics. Yeah, Kid Classics gets the distributing rights VHS-wise for the film. And that's how I watched it not only on television, but on VHS. So I got to see it in both different formats. I now own it, of course, like with Transformers and My Little Pony G1 movie. I own it on all the formats, if you will, that I know of. Well, at least the ones I can get my hands on, like Blu-ray, DVD, 4K Blu-ray, streaming, you name it. But, again, I watched it initially both ways that way. And just like with Transformers and My Little Pony G1's movies before it, it too eventually had its movie split into 5 parts. But I think they were done a lot sooner than Transformers and My Little Ponies was, because again, they were direct-to-television and video, so it made more sense to just automatically go to a miniseries, a few months after or something like that. That's what it felt like to me. But 1987 wasn't done. We ended up getting a live-action version of Masters of the Universe, which is a cult classic now. And look what's happening within a year. We're getting a new one, which is supposed to be more faithful to the original series, the original franchise. But we're not done. Oh no, we're not done, folks. 1988 comes around. And you have another one hitting the big screen. You have another one hitting the big screen. And they were trying to pump this up as a big deal. But in 1988, I have the poster. I have it packed away somewhere. I have the DVD. Believe it or not. But in 1988, we saw the debut on the big screen of Pound Puppies, the movie, Legend of Big Paw. No joke. No joke. 1988, we saw it. Pound Puppies, the movie, Legend of Big Paw. And was it a smash hit? No. Was it something that could have been mainly direct-to-video, direct-to-television? Yes. But it's got a cult status. People know about it. And I think it's one of the only 80s franchises, along with a few others, that have yet to get a Blu-ray release. But I think in time we might see that change. We might. But yeah, that came out, and I think Pound Puppies, when it went to syndication, the ABC series that is, I think they did put that into miniseries format as well. Not saying they did. And there were others, plenty of others, 80s franchises that I know of and I grew up on. They got movies as well, theatrically or not. Brave Star got one to help start its series, and so on. Well, and of course, Care Bears. Care Bears had a lot too, believe it or not. Care Bears, the Care Bears movie, I should say. Care Bears Movies 2, A New Generation, which retconned the first movie entirely. Then you had Care Bears Adventures in Wonderland, you had that and everything. And they weren't the only ones. They weren't the only ones either. You had Rainbow Brite and the Star Stealer, which led into the Rainbow Brite series. It's, and I do apologize, like I said, I think I mentioned this earlier, I am tired, I did work, but it's just amazing when you look at the 80s, like I said earlier, you could not turn your head for one moment, for one iota, if you will. You could not turn your head without seeing or hearing about a movie based on something that you were a fan of. You cannot turn your head whatsoever, one iota, one moment. And you want to know how big of a trend this was? Stan and Jan Berenstain did a book called The Berenstain Bears and the Bad Dream. And basically, one of the main subplots of it was brother was a fan of this franchise, kind of like a spoof on Transformers G.I.JOE, if you will. And he saw this, being advertised, he saw this being advertised, for a movie. He found out, oh, my favorite, franchise, my favorite toys are going to have a movie. He wanted to see it, and he did, and it gave him nightmares. One of those kind of situations, if you know what I mean. It's one of those situations, if you know what I mean. But anyway, even the Berenstain Bears knew how big of a trend this was being. Now, we wouldn't see anything like that for a while, until maybe later on. But still, it was like, it was just amazing to see and notice that this was happening. To notice that this thing was happening in a time frame that everybody considers the greatest decade. I know people will say the 90s and some will say the early to mid 2000s, but basically, I might be biased here, but growing up in the 80s, that was an age of, you could not, again, watch television without watching a series on there that ended up getting a movie. You couldn't. And basically, that's what happened in the 80s. In the 80s, you couldn't look anywhere, you couldn't hear anywhere, unless you found out you were getting to see a movie. And what's crazy is DuckTales the movie and the live-action TMNT basically were the ones that, in my opinion, in 1990, pretty much tied a bow on the 80s, if you know what I mean. They kind of tied a bow, on the 80s, and, basically... And like I said, basically showed that it didn't matter, what show or franchise you were. If you were popular enough, you were going to get a movie. You were going to get an animated film, if you know what I mean. You were going to get a movie, you were going to get an animated film. Whether it's theatrical, direct-to-video, direct-to-television, you name it, you were going to get an animated film. And basically... when you think about it, it would have continued too. It would have continued too had DuckTales the movie not bombed at the box office, because there was plans. There were plans to do many more Disney Afternoon related movies in theaters. There were plans, but DuckTales the movie bombed at the box office, and those plans pretty much went up in smoke or had to be altered to go a different route. But yeah, Anyway, though, guys, I wanted to come on here and just talk about, how, in the 80s, like I said, you could just not look one way or another without knowing that a movie, was being made on something you are a fan of. But let me know what your thoughts are, guys. Comment down below, like the video, ring the bell for notifications, subscribe to the channel. Also, click on the links in the description to find my content also outside of YouTube, as well as on the last link in the description to go to my Teespring store for merchandise you can't get anywhere else. But guys, give me your thoughts on what I had to say here. For any of you that grew up in that time frame like I did, what were your thoughts, knowing that you could not go one way or another without hearing about a movie being made? Let me know what your thoughts are overall, guys. And until next time, I will talk to you later. So until then, I'm out.